Good morning, Jude, and how nice to see you. Lovely paintings in the background, and thank you for taking the time this morning to have a chat about webcam and how we come across. People spend so much time nowadays online, so it's an important topic how we come across online. So I thought we could have a chat about that.
Great, thank you for having me.
I know, I mean, we've worked for many years already online, so you have plenty of experience, you have plenty of ideas about it. So I'm really keen to hear about how you think, for instance, about the intent behind the person. You know, what I know you have some thoughts around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm really struck by what we've always said at Nomadic is that if you use any technology, use it with a purpose. I mean, that seems very obvious stated like that. However, you know, there's such an array of things we can use these days, some really quite brilliant tools. So using something like webcam, we do need to be aware that it has an impact. It can achieve different objectives in different situations, but simply using it by default because it's there is something that's, I'd say, even more important to think about now. It always has been important. Now, particularly when we spend so much more time online, of course, webcam can do a lot and it can also get in our way at times. So that's something I'm very aware of. And I think just to sort of, you know, make that point a bit more strongly, there's a kind of, one might say, growing psychology around this now, and that might seem like a bit of a big term to use, but people are more and more aware of the impact of certain tools. We've all been through, I would guess, a pretty tough 2 years or so, and how we connect with each other, how we look, how we present ourselves in the virtual space is more important than ever for, you know, building trust, keeping teams performing well, and, you know, and feeling motivated and so on. Interesting topic, I think. Yeah.
And of course, you and I, we've been doing this for a while, and with our team, and since COVID now, a little more than 2 years. Everybody has been getting used to working online. How have things changed in this respect? How we present ourselves on camera?
Well, I think one thing that's very obvious, as you've just said, is that we're spending so much more time here. And from my experience, at the start of the pandemic, you know, a lot of people were feeling quite dissociated from each other, and of course we couldn't go out. We had to have meetings in this way. For some people, that must have been entirely new. I mean, of course, we've had this technology for quite some years. Suddenly it became a kind of lifeline, one might almost say, for some people. Meetings took on a different flavour. What I was aware of in the early days, so, you know, 2020, let's say, March, April 2020, is people feeling nervous and wanting to make meetings kind of a sociable thing, but not really knowing how. And also, you know, really kind of wanting to use the time well in meetings. So in the early trainings we did in that period, at least, I noticed a lot of kind of fear and people sort of feeling quite anxious about whether they could carry on working in this way. And then in those days, I think we kind of used webcam pretty much all the time. It was so important to see who you were sort of facing in a way. And since then, I think it's kind of become the new normal. That's the phrase that people have used. So it's sort of the norm. We're used to getting in front of the screen, we turn the webcam on, and now it's almost unusual to not have it on. And I think that with that, you know, we have to think of what we're doing here. And in terms of effectiveness as people training, leading in the virtual space, you know, how we use the tools does matter, as I've just said. So, you know, there may be times when it's more effective to not have the camera on, and we need to focus on that. What I've seen happening is people using webcam sort of by default, and it can be quite disengaging. I think there are certain ways that I'd like to talk about with you about using webcam to build trust and to really get a sense of, you know, who are we with? We don't have our sensory engagement in the same way as when we're in a room together. So how can we use the tools to best effect, you know, including webcam? I'm just thinking about occasion when some poor woman in a meeting quite early in the COVID pandemic left her webcam on to go to the toilet, poor lady. And of course, you know, that went viral. There are these awful mistakes one can make. I mean, that's just on a practical level. That's as important as it ever was. Just earlier on, if I may say so, but perhaps unfairly, you turned around to talk to your dog whilst I was having a chat with you. I mean, if we were in a meeting together, I might think, oh, that's not very nice. So once we're all looking at each other, it's really important to be consistent with that. And so I think the etiquette point about webcam use, you know, everyone turns it on, or we say if we're not going to use it. That's really important, especially when you don't know the people you're working with. Why is somebody suddenly not appearing on screen? These questions can come up. And of course, when someone sort of wanders off and they're on webcam to do something without saying why, again, there's an impact there. And it kind of might be the etiquette in a group that it's okay to do that, but it does need discussing. And that's always been what we said. I think now it's more important than ever, because it's still a main connection for us.
You mentioned the sort of hold me background and the dog and the child in the image. I remember at the beginning that was a big thing, and these things are viral. My experience now, we've gotten used to that. We know that people are working from home or from a public space, so we're sort of used to having the dog or the cat join the session. That's not a big thing anymore. But it reminds me of the type of background. I always tend to look and maybe even be distracted by people's background, and I have certain preferences. Some people like virtual backgrounds. I saw one yesterday, a site where you could download different backgrounds, and I saw the Simpsons sofa using as a background, which I found quite humorous. Do you have a preference for a specific? I mean, I love the 3 paintings behind you, for instance. Do you have a preference when it comes to backgrounds?
Actually, no. Well, perhaps for myself, I might say, at least, I prefer not to have one. Partly because one can be quite kind of sophisticated with these things these days. But I haven't. Well, there are various technologies, obviously, for concealing your background or giving you a certain office look. They tend to be pretty universal. So the ones available on Zoom, we've all seen them. So we know that person is not really sitting in, I don't know, somewhere in London, in Mayfair, with a rather posh, fancy office suite, or equivalent of in Amsterdam or Hong Kong or wherever. So I prefer not to use them. But what I do find really interesting, and I don't mean that I prefer other people not to use them, I simply mean that now that anyone can, it's interesting to think about where that takes us. And you've just said, you can look at people, what books they've got there, or it can be a distraction. And it's also interesting how much information we might take from it, or perhaps I should say assumptions we might make. So that looks like quite a decent sized room you've got there, Fredrik, and you've got a dog. Gosh, I wonder how big your house is. And one can go on from there. So it's just, in terms of kind of a sense of, I don't know about equality, but a sense of kind of maybe trust. I think there's something, again, important about, are we going to have our background visible or not? What do we want people to know about us from what we present? And those first impressions are as important as, are you wearing a suit in a business meeting, if that's the done thing, and so on. I'm really aware, I mean, just as an aside in a way, people working from home, and again, in the early days of the pandemic, how much it mattered if you had children or a dog. I mean, I've got a dog and my children are grown up now, but, making sure that you don't have the child running past. We've all seen, I think, news presenters on TV with the kiddie who's just burst into the room while they're in the middle of a very important, session. And so there's a point to the virtual background. I just think now, because we're so used to it, it's important to think, okay, do I want people to sort of really see where I am? And what do I want them to know about me when you're meeting a group for the first time? Maybe it would be nice if they could see my setting, if it's safe and okay to do so. Obviously, you haven't got children there, etc. I don't know. I think it can sort of establish, and I don't know if you agree with me, a sort of sense of common humanity. We're not screening anything off. We're visible. And if, fairly presentable, then why not? What do you think? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. Some people may not everyone may have the luxury of a home office space, which I'm fortunate to have, and you have. I mean, as you say, some people might live in smaller circumstances with children and working from the kitchen table. But generally, we connect through technology, through digital means. So there's an element of distance and virtualness. So I actually appreciate the real background, like your paintings again. You used the example earlier, and I like to have fresh flowers in my office. So you see something real. There's so much virtual anyway. So that is my preference. And I read an article in the New York Times. I've mentioned her in my one of my blogs. It was an American artist, who played around and used her creative talent on this topic, and she says she always have different works of art. She changes them in her background, and bowls of fruit. She had different arrangements of fruit in the background. So I found that quite an appealing notion, if you want.
That just reminds me of how much information we take in just by looking not just at people, and of course I know you, but the background, what's there, what does it say? And I think, if one wanted to go to a meeting and just instantly go to the agenda and not really know who you're talking to, and sometimes I guess there is a point to that kind of meeting, it's a very quick, decisive meeting, maybe it doesn't matter. But if you want to get to know a new team, you can imagine all kinds of contexts in which being able to see a little bit of their life in the background helps. I think maybe a cultural thing as well. I don't really know. I imagine there may be some research into this at some point, if not already. What we choose to present about us in the first instance is a trust activity. And, it may be that in some corporate, at least, cultures, one does screen it off. It's good to look sort of slick and so people can just see you. And in others, no, it's much more important to see what is this person's family setting, if you like, if they're working.
Yeah, it gives you a bit of context, and it opens the door to another person. I think the virtual background, although I understand some corporations need to present themselves universally, it's a bit like a uniform, if you in a hotel or an airline, all the staff wears the same uniform. It gives me that sort of an impression. What do you want? What do you want to present?
Yes.
Anyway, I know you had some thoughts about focus and power as well around this topic. Is that something you want to tell us about?
Yes. Well, I mentioned earlier kind of this point about on some platforms, using today, for example, we can see a group of people in different webcam settings, and the focus of that. So when one's presenting in this space, if you're on full screen, obviously you're dominating visually. And it's difficult to see other things unless one looks right away from the computer and at something else. So it's commanding, and it's commanding in a way that's quite different from when you're sitting in a room with people around a table, because we can look at them equally, and it may not be too weird to do that. When someone's presenting and we take our eyes off them and start looking elsewhere, it really makes a bigger impact in the virtual setting. And I'm just very interested in that. I'm also interested in, do we always need to go to presenter view, for example? What is the power, can I say, impact of those different settings? And I haven't really drawn any conclusions on that, but I think it does have an impact. And I think, so then again, come back to, if you're not going to be on webcam and everyone else is, maybe something needs to be said about that. It does need a little bit more explanation. And I think investigation, actually. So it's a topic that we kind of just accept, we will do this. We've got these different options for settings, but what difference do they make? I just wanted to say, your question just reminded me, thinking about this question of trust and how we develop that. Some games and activities we've used in our trainings have been exactly around using webcam to sort of find out about people or find out how much you do and don't know. So with new groups, for example, maybe they might have met once or twice. We've done activities where everyone's on webcam and it might be the producer or the trainer sends a message to one of them saying something like, "You've just won 5 million euros, whichever currency." We do let people know we're going to do this. And the game is, as you know, to look and see who has just got that message in their chat box. It's fun, of course, and it's playful, and that's all to the good. And it does also get people really looking at each other and it kind of with something in mind, has this person just got rich or not? I think that kind of activity can be a really good way of getting to sort of understand, as I said earlier, kind of each other's like repertoire, way of behaving, way of looking online. And in that way, we can get to know each other a bit better, know what's kind of going on for us and how we are. And I think that kind of thing happens quite subtly and we may not be aware of it. But yeah, those kinds of activities can be really helpful with that.
Yeah, good point. And there's one thing you reminded me of when you talked about power and being in presenter view. I heard somebody say that a tool like Zoom or WebEx or Microsoft Teams is actually quite democratic because everybody appears in the same size box on the screen when you've got the whole group on the screen. So it's difficult to present yourself as more influential than others when you come in the same size shoe box if you want. On the other hand, another thought I had is that the software engineers, the people at Zoom and Microsoft who designed this tool for us, they actually influence the social fabric of online meetings, because how we're displayed on screen, it has an influence unconsciously, on the group dynamic and how we communicate and how we present to each other. And of course, it is engineered by the developers. And unknowingly, maybe even the fact that somebody like that software engineer is more introverted or more extroverted, or comes from a specific culture, has an influence on the social fabric. And you see that different tools display our images differently on screen, and whether we like it or not, that has an immediate impact also. So that's thing to think about. How much do we want to be influenced by these people who design these tools with good intentions, obviously.
Just a point on that, and thank you for reminding me. I think various people are looking into this. I don't know if I can mention Jane Miller here, just as an aside, but we have colleagues who are interested in maybe others, but the impacts of how people manage personality preferences in the online space. So your example, I mean, there may be people who are more extroverted, who like to express themselves more freely perhaps than others. There may be others in a meeting who like to take time to think and will only offer their ideas when they've really had that reflection point, sort of thing. And I think Amy Redmondson at HBR, Harvard Business Review, writes on this, on her use of tools to kind of achieve different impacts. I was just thinking in a meeting, if you have a bunch of extroverts, I'm being a bit cliched about this, everyone might want to be on webcam, and there might be quite a lot, let's say, of talking over each other. One might imagine a meeting of quite clear introverts who may be sort of one at a time and a careful thought, and then is it okay to come in, excuse me, and interrupt? So one can use webcam to interrupt quite effectively. If you're not on webcam, you suddenly turn it on and say something, that's quite explosive, and I think it's okay. But I think it's something we need to be aware of and think about, again, in terms of how we manage meetings and how we meet different training needs. And I was thinking about Ghislaine Collard, whose work is very much respected, and that idea she has about messy talk. When you're communicating remotely, that sort of spontaneous flow of conversation and how enabling that can be. And of course, within that, you also have to think about, is everyone feeling heard? Because some conversations can be more spontaneous than others or expressive than others. So yeah, keeping that and managing it for everyone in your team is really quite something to think about.
Speaking of being heard, and maybe as the last thing, because our time is almost up, you said, I know you do some work with in the health sector, with people who work in sensitive situations, healthcare workers, and are there situations, do you think, where you're better off without the camera, with audio only, for instance?
I think that's a very good question. I would say definitely yes, there are situations in which it's more effective to not use the camera. I think about it, as you just referenced, Fredrik, in connection with people who may have some very difficult issues to discuss. I work with doctors in training a fair bit in the UK, and you can imagine how the last 2 years have been for them. So it is important to think about what is the impact of being visible or invisible when you're dealing with a fairly heavy emotional load. What I found is, quite often at the beginning of a meeting, when I'm working with someone who wants to talk about some fairly tough stuff, it's very important to have that visual connection, almost universally, to be able to see them, to make connection, clearly to show you're listening. And I think that really matters, almost without exception. What I've also noticed is that once there's a little bit of trust established, that it's sometimes it can feel quite sort of full on, as we say, to be constantly looking at someone while they're talking about some things that they may find very difficult. And I've discovered that sometimes just clicking off the webcam, if we both do it in a one-to-one, is enabling. And we might open a whiteboard instead, so there's something to look at and do some drawing. Obviously, you can use metaphors in that way. You can draw images that suggest a feeling and so on. Or it may simply be really just having that blank screen. would rarely use slides in that setting, but sometimes people can really go with their imagination when they're not being looked at. It may again be down to your personality, of course, but not be seen and talk about tough stuff and be able to also look with hope, I think requires us to not always be visible, not always be looking at something, but to let our imagination take us. And that seems to me to be easier when you're not looking at someone. That may be a point for debate. That's what I've noticed. I'm really surprised because when I first started working in this way, I thought, it's really important that we see each other. And I think it is initially, but after that, it's somehow enabling to kind of fly in the blank space.
I think this has been quite a rich conversation. Before we close, is there anything else you want to add? I
think the thing that really emerges now, or for me at least, is about understanding people, looking for understanding and trust on any level, in any meeting, because without that, we're having a fairly two-dimensional meeting. And I think webcam can play a very valuable part in that. If we use it with intent, as I said at the start of this conversation, just being aware of what it can achieve and what it can do and how it can get in the way. But I think there's a lot of learning still to be done. We've come through, in some ways, we've come through a crisis and we're still going through it. And how do we connect well with each other when we can't be always together, physically together? Yeah.
Well, I want to close by thanking you very much for your time and this rich conversations and all your contributions. So I hope it's worthwhile for our listeners, our viewers.